Hey everyone, welcome back. My name's Tim, and today we're diving into some chilling tales with stories like Don't Meet Imaginary Friends, Neighbor's Open Door, and Grandpa's Summer Freeze. Make sure to watch until the end because the scariest story is waiting for you there. Make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button to support more creepy content. Now, let's get started with the first story. My grandfather froze to death on the kitchen floor in the middle of summer, and I'm the only person who knows what happened. My mom found him early on the morning of July 15th, stretched out between the refrigerator and the breakfast table like he'd been reaching for something. His skin was blue-white, ice crystals still clinging to his eyelashes when Mom screamed from the doorway. The thermometer on the kitchen wall read 82 degrees. I'm Theo, 17, part-time sandwich artist at Subway, full-time disappointment to my parents' college fund expectations. Normal kid from normal Midwestern stock, the kind who knows the difference between a blizzard watch and a blizzard warning, who can drive in snow before I can parallel park. I played JV basketball badly and worked the closing shift 3 nights a week, biking home past empty storefronts and gas stations that close at 10. Nothing about my life prepared me for finding my grandfather's body that morning or for understanding what had happened. My grandpa, Isaac, had lived with us for 4 years, ever since Grandma died and Dad decided the old man shouldn't be rattling around their farmhouse alone. Grandpa was 74, with arthritis in his hands and a habit of falling asleep in his recliner with the TV remote balanced on his chest. He'd worked 20 years managing the local IGA before retiring, knew everyone in town, remembered their kids' names and which checkout girls gave the best customer service. He was practical, steady, unremarkable in every way that mattered. He was also dead in our kitchen, ice cold in 80-degree weather. The coroner, Dr. Willits, spent 45 minutes examining the body. He took photographs, checked the thermostat, questioned Mom and Dad about Grandpa's health, his medications, whether he'd seemed confused or disoriented lately. He measured the room temperature 3 times with different thermometers, frowning at readings that made no sense. Hypothermia, he announced finally, signing papers with the kind of confidence that comes from 3 decades of determining cause of death. Severe hypothermia due to unknown environmental factors. Possibly a neurological episode affecting temperature regulation. Dad asked the obvious question, how does someone freeze to death when it's 80 degrees outside? Dr. Willits adjusted his glasses and delivered the answer that would satisfy the insurance company, the death certificate, and everyone except me. Sometimes the body's regulatory system fails catastrophically. Medication interactions, undiagnosed conditions, stroke affecting the hypothalamus. The body can literally lose the ability to maintain core temperature. Mom mentioned the frost she'd seen around the body, but Dr. Willits dismissed it as condensation from the air conditioning. I didn't correct him, even though RAC had been off for 3 days. The funeral was on Thursday. Half the town showed up, filing past the casket to pay respects to a man who'd bagged their groceries and remembered their faces for 2 decades. They spoke about his kindness, his reliability, how he'd given their teenagers first jobs and second chances. None of them knew about the temperature of his skin when they found him, or the thin layer of frost that had formed around his body, like he'd been lying there in January instead of July. None of them had seen what I saw when I came downstairs that morning, when Mom's screaming brought me and Dad running. I saw my grandfather's final expression, frozen on his face in the moment death took him. He wore no peaceful look, like most people would imagine. His eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling, and his mouth was open like he'd been trying to say something important. He looked terrified. Strange things started happening 2 months ago. May 28th in Minnesota means tornado watches and sudden thunderstorms, the kind of weather that keeps you checking the sky every few minutes. It doesn't mean finding patches of kitchen floors so cold they make your feet ache through wool socks. But that's exactly what I found that Tuesday morning after Memorial Day. A circle of tile near the sink that felt like stepping on January pavement. Mom blamed the air conditioning, even though we hadn't turned it on yet. Dad checked the basement for broken pipes, crawling around with a flashlight and muttering about foundations settling. The cold spot vanished by Thursday, but another one appeared in the hallway upstairs, then another in the living room by the weekend. "Old houses settle," Dad said when I mentioned it. "Foundation shifts, creates drafts you wouldn't expect." Our house was built in 1987. It wasn't exactly old by anyone's standard. Dad liked cheap explanations that didn't require calling repair services. I pressed my palm against the frigid patch of living room carpet, watching my breath form small clouds in the 70-degree air. When I called Mom over to feel it, her hand passed through the cold like it wasn't there. "Feels normal to me, honey," she said, giving me that concerned look parents get when they think you're coming down with something. But I could see the frost forming on the carpet fibers where my breath hit them. The winter winds started a week later. I'd be watching TV or doing homework and suddenly smell snow in the air, that sharp, clean scent that comes before a blizzard. The smell would drift through rooms like invisible smoke, carrying whispers I could almost understand. Once I followed the scent upstairs to Grandpa's room, where he was sitting on his bed looking at old photo albums, his face pale and distracted. "You smell that?" I asked him. He looked up from a picture of him and Grandma at some company picnic. His hands were shaking as he closed the album. "Smell what?" "Like snow. Like winter." "It's May, Theo." But his voice cracked when he said it, and I noticed he was wearing a sweater despite the warm afternoon. "The whispers came with the wind that smelled like snow, voices so quiet I couldn't be sure I was actually hearing them. Sometimes they seemed to be calling a name, sometimes just murmuring, like people having a conversation in another room. I'd turn my head to catch the words, but they'd fade into nothing, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined them entirely. But Grandpa heard them too. I'd find him sitting in his chair at midnight, eyes wide open, responding to things the rest of the family couldn't detect. "I'm sorry," he'd whisper to the empty room. "I know you're cold. I know." When I asked him who he was talking to, he'd look at me with the desperate expression of a drowning man. "You can hear them too, can't you, Theo?" His voice barely above a whisper. "The voices in the wind." I nodded, and something between relief and terror crossed his face. "Then you know she's coming." The shivering started in June. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, teeth chattering, pulling my covers tight around me. The room would feel normal to everyone else, maybe even warm, but my body acted like I'd been sleeping outside. When I mentioned it to Mom, she immediately started checking for fever and asking about my appetite. "Growing boys need more calories," she said, adding extra bacon to my breakfast. "Your metabolism's probably just running high." She couldn't see the frost forming on my bedroom windows while the thermostat read 75 degrees. Grandpa started acting strange around the same time, but this was different from the whispers. This was paranoia. He began looking over his shoulder when we watched TV together, checking the locks on doors that nobody ever used. During dinner, he'd pause mid-sentence and listen to sounds the rest of us couldn't hear, his fork halfway to his mouth, eyes darting toward the kitchen doorway. "Nothing there," he'd mutter when I followed his gaze. "Just tired." But tired people don't spend 20 minutes staring at the same photograph, and they don't whisper apologies to themselves while they think no one's listening. I started finding him with those photo albums more often, usually the ones from his working years at the IGA. He'd flip through pages slowly, his finger tracing faces I didn't recognize, his lips moving in silent conversation. One afternoon in late June, I found him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, still in his pajamas, staring at the spot where his body would be found 3 weeks later. The linoleum around his bare feet was covered in frost that sparkled under the overhead light. "Grandpa?" He turned toward me, but his eyes took a moment to focus, like he was seeing me from across a great distance. When he exhaled, his breath formed a small cloud between us. "She's coming," he said quietly. "She's been walking through the snow for 27 years, and now she's almost here." "Who's coming?" I shouldn't have stopped. I should have helped her. But she was so cruel, Theo. So very, very cruel. I asked him what he meant, who he was talking to, but he just shook his head and shuffled back to his room, leaving wet footprints on the kitchen floor that steamed in the warm air. Everything came together the night I saw her. It was July 4th, just past midnight. Fireworks had been going off all evening, late celebrations from people who'd bought too many bottle rockets and didn't want to waste them. I was lying in bed, listening to the occasional pop and crackle from somewhere across town, when the temperature in my room dropped 20 degrees in the span of a heartbeat. I sat up, pulling my sheet around me, and saw her floating 3 feet above the hallway carpet. She was translucent, like looking through ice, but I could make out her basic shape, a woman in what might have been a winter coat, her hair hanging in frozen strands around her face. Snow clung to her shoulders and sleeves, never melting, never falling. She moved without walking, drifting down the hall toward Grandpa's room, with the deliberate purpose of someone who knew exactly where she was going. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but watch as she passed my doorway, leaving a trail of frost on the walls where she'd been. The air around her shimmered with cold, and I could hear the sound winter makes, that particular silence that comes with heavy snow, broken only by the soft whisper of ice crystals forming. She turned her head toward me as she passed, and for just a moment I saw her face clearly. Her eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and empty, and cold enough to freeze blood. Her mouth was open in an expression that might have been speaking, but no sound came out. Just that patient, terrible silence. When she reached Grandpa's door, she didn't open it. She simply passed through the wood like it was made of mist. I stayed in bed until morning, wrapped in every blanket I owned, listening to the one-sided conversation that drifted through the walls. Grandpa's voice apologizing over and over again to someone who answered only with the sound of wind through bare trees. By the time the sun came up, the temperature had returned to normal, but I found a single perfect snowflake on my windowsill, refusing to melt despite the July heat. I knew then that my grandfather was going to die, and that I was the only one who would understand why. My grandfather told me the worst thing he'd ever done. It was July 13th, 2 days before we found him dead on the kitchen floor. He'd spent the morning pacing between his bedroom and the kitchen, muttering under his breath and checking door locks that were already secure. The house felt like a meat locker, despite the air conditioning being off, but only Grandpa and I seemed to notice.
By afternoon, he looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. "Theo," he said, finding me in the garage where I was fixing a flat tire on my bike. "I need to tell you something. About Mary." I'd never heard him mention anyone named Mary before, but something in his voice made me set down my wrench and pay attention. He looked older than his 74 years, his shoulders bent forward like he was carrying something impossibly heavy. When he breathed, small puffs of vapor escaped his lips despite the stifling heat. "I worked at the IGA for 20 years. Made some good friends there. Jimmy in produce, Alice in customer service, Bill who ran the meat counter." He paused, his hands working against each other in his lap. "And then there was Mary." The temperature in the garage dropped 10 degrees when he said her name. She worked in the office. Bookkeeping, scheduling, handling complaints. Been there longer than anyone. Maybe 15 years when I started. Everyone called her Mean Mary behind her back, though never where she could hear it. His voice got quieter, more distant, like he was seeing something I couldn't.
Mary had a talent for finding people's weaknesses and pressing on them until they broke. New employees, part-timers who couldn't afford to quit, anyone she thought was beneath her. But what she did to Tommy was the day I knew she was something beyond cruel, beyond human, maybe. The Tuesday she destroyed Tommy was like watching a predator hunt. Tommy worked maintenance, had some kind of mental problem that made him talk slowly and repeat himself sometimes. Sweet kid, maybe 25, lived with his mother and needed that job more than anything. A customer complained about water on the floor near produce. Standard stuff, happens every day. Grandpa's breath came out in visible puffs now, and frost began forming on the workbench where his hands rested. Mary saw her chance. She called Tommy over to the customer service counter where everyone could see. Employees, shoppers, kids waiting with their mothers. Started interrogating him about his careless mopping, making her voice loud enough for the whole front end to hear. I could see the scene playing out in his eyes, 27 years of guilt etched in the lines around them. Then she started imitating his speech, made her voice slow and halting like his, stumbling over words the way he did when he got nervous. "Tommy, sorry. Tommy, try harder." She kept getting louder, drawing more people over to watch this grown man being humiliated like a child. The frost was spreading now, crawling up the garage walls in delicate patterns that caught the afternoon light. Tommy just stood there holding his mop, tears streaming down his face. He didn't understand why everyone was laughing. Mary wasn't done. She told the customer, loud enough for everyone to hear, that Tommy was mentally deficient and that the store kept him on out of charity. Said maybe they should find someone more capable to clean up after normal people. Grandpa's voice broke completely. The customer looked horrified, tried to say it wasn't that big a deal, just a wet floor. But Mary kept going, called Tommy a burden on decent society, and said his mother should be ashamed for inflicting him on normal people. Tommy collapsed right there, sobbing so hard he couldn't breathe. He never came back. Found out later his mother had to take him to the emergency room that night because he wouldn't stop shaking. The doctor said it was a panic attack, but I knew better. Mary had broken something inside him that never got fixed. That was the kind of person Mary was, someone who could destroy an innocent man for entertainment and sleep soundly that night.
I asked him why he was telling me this, what Mary had to do with the cold spots and whispers that followed us through the house. His hand stopped moving. When he looked at me, his eyes were wet and desperate. Because I'm the reason she's dead. The story came out slowly, like he was pulling each word from somewhere deep and painful. February 14th, 1998. 7 years before I was born. A blizzard had moved in faster than predicted, dropping 19 inches of snow in 6 hours and creating whiteout conditions across 3 counties. Store management made the call to close early, 2 in the afternoon instead of 9 at night. Everyone was anxious to get home before the roads became completely impassable. Mary had left first, as she always did. She lived alone in a rented house on the other side of town and drove an old Buick that wasn't reliable in the best conditions, let alone in a blizzard. Grandpa had stayed another hour, helping to secure the store and making sure that all the coolers and freezers were properly sealed in case they lost power. By the time he left, the snow was falling so hard he could barely see his truck in the parking lot. I took County Road 47. It was faster, and your grandmother was waiting with dinner. I'd driven that road 1,000 times. His voice got quieter, forcing me to lean closer to hear. I saw her headlights first, flashing on and off, like someone signaling for help. The Buick was nose first in a snowbank, maybe 15 yards off the road. As I got closer, I could see Mary standing beside her car, waving her arms frantically. Even through the snow and wind, I could tell she was in trouble. I pulled over, sat there with my engine running, looking through my windshield at her. She was walking toward me, stumbling through knee-deep snow. The garage was freezing now, cold enough that I could see my own breath mixing with his in the space between us. I thought about Tommy crying while everyone laughed, about the way that she had called him deficient, a burden. I thought about the kind of person who could destroy someone like Tommy and sleep soundly that night. His hands were shaking now, from the cold or emotions, I couldn't tell. She reached my truck, started pounding on the passenger window with her fists, screaming something I couldn't hear over the wind. Her face was pressed against the glass, and I could see the terror in her eyes. She knew she was going to die out there if no one helped her. I put the truck in drive and kept going. The words hung between us like icicles. She ran after me for maybe 20 yards, waving and screaming. I watched her in my rearview mirror until the snow swallowed her up. Then I drove home and told my grandmother I'd taken the main route because it was safer. They didn't find Mary's body until March, when the snow finally melted enough for a farmer to spot something that didn't belong in his field. She'd made it almost a mile from her car before the cold took her. Found frozen in a drainage ditch with her arms wrapped around herself, still wearing the same winter coat I had seen floating through our hallway.
"I killed her," Grandpa whispered, "and I've been living with that for 27 years. The frost had covered every surface in the garage now, turning our breath into clouds and making the metal tools ring like bells when the expanding ice shifted them. "She's been walking through that blizzard ever since," he said. "Walking through the snow and the cold, getting closer every year. And now she's found me." I asked him why he was telling me this now, after keeping it secret for so long. He looked toward the house, where shadows were beginning to gather in the windows as evening approached. "Because she's here, Theo. She's been in my room every night for a week, standing at the foot of my bed, dripping snow melt on the carpet. She doesn't say anything, just watches me with those frozen eyes." His voice dropped to almost nothing. "And I think you're the only one who can see her too." The air conditioner stayed off for the last 2 days of my grandfather's life. After his confession in the garage, he became obsessed with heat. Every time someone turned on the AC to combat the mid-80s weather, he'd shut it off within minutes, his hands shaking as he adjusted the thermostat. "Can't stand the cold air," he'd mutter, pulling on another sweater despite the sweltering house. When Dad complained about the temperature, Grandpa begged. "Just keep it off," he pleaded, "please." The whispers were constant now. Where before I'd barely been able to make out voices on the wind, now I could hear words clearly. "Left me. So cold." They drifted through the house like smoke, always in Mary's voice, though I'd never heard her speak when she was alive. Mom and Dad noticed Grandpa's behavior, but attributed it to grief or maybe early dementia. They scheduled a doctor's appointment for the following week and talked in hushed voices about assisted living facilities and medication adjustments. They couldn't see the frost forming on windows despite the 80-degree indoor temperature. They couldn't see the way their breath became visible whenever they stood too close to Grandpa's usual spots. When I pressed Mom's hand against a wall covered in ice, her fingers passed through it like it wasn't there. "Don't you feel that?" I asked desperately. "Feel what, honey?" She looked at me with growing concern. "Are you feeling all right?" But I could see the frost spreading under her touch, could feel the supernatural cold seeping through my clothes and into my bones. On July 14th, the day before he died, Grandpa stopped sleeping entirely. I found him in the living room at 2 a.m, fully dressed, staring at the front door. The house was stifling without air conditioning, but his breath formed steady clouds when he spoke. "She's getting closer," he said without looking at me. "Where is she?" "Right there." He pointed toward the empty hallway. "Can't you see her? She's standing by the stairs, just watching." I looked where he was pointing and saw nothing but shadows, but the temperature in that spot had to be below freezing because frost was forming on the wall in the shape of a woman. "What is she doing?" "Nothing. Just looking at me. But I can feel the cold coming off her, like standing next to an open freezer. And her eyes," he shuddered, "her eyes are like looking into a January sky." We sat together until dawn. I held his frail, cold hand, listening to him whispering apologies to the empty air while I watched frost patterns spread across surfaces that should have been warm. When the sun came up, he seemed relaxed slightly, but I knew the relief was temporary. That evening, our house felt like an oven. The air conditioner sat silent while the July heat pushed the indoor temperature well into the 90s. Every fan in the house ran at full speed, but they couldn't compete with the supernatural winter that followed my grandfather from room to room. The whispers started earlier than usual, just after sunset. This time, they weren't random phrases, but something more focused, more demanding. I couldn't make out all the words, but Grandpa could. He sat in his chair, no longer pretending he couldn't hear her. "I know," he said to the empty room, his voice steady for the first time in days. "I remember leaving you there." A pause, as if he were listening to something I couldn't quite catch. "Yes, you called my name. You begged me to help me." Another pause, longer this time. The frost was spreading faster now, covering the walls around his chair in intricate ice patterns. "I'm sorry," his voice cracked. "I'm so sorry, Mary, but you have to understand what you did to those people." The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in thick clouds, and ice began forming on the inside of windows. "No," Grandpa said, shaking his head. "Sorry isn't enough. I know that now." The conversation continued for hours, Grandpa responding to accusations I could only partially hear, accepting blame for a decision that had haunted him for 27 years. Sometimes I caught fragments of her voice on the wind. "Left me to die, so cold." They drifted through the house like smoke. Near midnight, his voice changed, became resigned. Yes, you were alone. You died alone because of me, and that was cruel. Maybe as cruel as anything you ever did. I deserve this. But please, leave my family alone. They don't know what I did," he said with a tired, dejected voice. By 1 a.m, the house felt like a walk-in freezer. Ice covered every surface I could see, turning our home into a winter landscape. The whispers had stopped, replaced by something worse, the sound of someone breathing slowly in the darkness, each exhalation bringing more cold. "Theo," he said, with all the warmth and affection he could muster, "go to bed. You can't help me. I'm ready. I'm tired, and this is nothing you or anyone should ever have to see." I went to bed, knowing I'd never see my grandfather alive again, but unable to do anything except watch it happen. Mary had finally gotten her revenge, and she'd made sure my grandfather experienced every moment of the cold that killed her. The only difference was that she had died alone in a field, while he died surrounded by the warmth of a family who loved him. It wasn't mercy. It was just a different kind of cruelty. 3 weeks later, I sent my college applications exclusively to schools in Florida and Arizona. Some things are too cold to forget, and I never want to feel winter again. The frost disappeared from our house the day we buried Grandpa, but sometimes on the colder nights, I still hear whispers in the wind. They're fainter now, more distant, like someone calling from very far away. I think Mary is walking again, looking for the next person who left someone to die in the cold.
Never let your children meet their imaginary friends in person. Never. It was the last week of summer. That I knew. We all knew it. We all felt it. The kids in town were going to bed each night, tossing and turning, knowing they'd soon be fighting for that extra 15 minutes of sleep. Soon we'd no longer be waking up to the sun gleaming in our eyes, but instead a cacophony of alarms tearing our dreams in half. Back to early mornings and tyrant teachers sucking the lives out of our poor captive souls. What I didn't know was that final week of summer would be the last time I'd ever see my friends that I had never even met. Kevin and Jordy were my best friends, my brothers. They were in my life for as long as I could remember. Kevin was a year older than me, and Jordy was a year younger. Our bond was nearly that of twins, or triplets for that matter. We were there to witness each other's first steps, words, laughs, everything. Even before the universe could switch on my consciousness, it was like they were always by my side, floating in some eternal void I could never make sense of. From what I can remember, my childhood was normal. I was well fed. My parents told me stories at night. They loved me enough to kiss my wounds when I took a spill. I got into trouble, but not too much trouble. My bed stayed dry most of the time. Things were good. It wasn't until I was about 9 when my normalcy came into question. Our son is going to grow up to be a freak. I bet the Smithson's boy doesn't go to his room and sit in total silence all day and night. It's not his fault. I'm a terrible father. If he grows up to be the weird kid, we are going to be known as the weird parents. The boy needs help. My father's voice could reach the back of an auditorium, so down the hall and to the left was no chore for his booming words when they came passing through my bedroom door and into my little ears. From outside looking in, sure, I was the weird kid. How could I not be? It's perfectly normal for an only child to have a couple of cute and precious imaginary friends when they are a toddler. But that cutesy feeling turns into an acid climbing up the back of a parent's throat when their child is approaching double digits. Dad did his damnedest to get me involved in sports, scouts, things that moved fast or sounded fast, things that would get me hurt in all the right ways. Mom, well, she was Mom. I was her baby boy.
And no matter how strange and off-kilter I might have been, I was her strange and off-kilter boy.
As I settled into my preteen years, the cutesy act ended, and Act 2, or the boy get out of your room and get your ass outside act, began. For years, I had tried explaining to my parents and everyone around me that Kevin and Jordy were real, but nobody believed me. Whatever grief my parents gave me was multiplied tenfold by the kids at school. By that time, any boy in his right mind would have dropped the act and made an effort to adjust, but not me. The hell I caught was worth it. I knew they were real. Kevin and Jordy knew things I didn't. I remember the math test hanging on our fridge. A+. "I'm so proud of you," my mom said. "Looks like we have a little Einstein in the house." Nope, wasn't me. That was all Kevin. I'm not one to condone cheating, but if you were born with a gift like us three shared, you'd use it too. The night before that test, I was in the clubhouse with the boys. At least, that's what we called it. Our clubhouse wasn't built with splintered boards and rusty nails, but with imagination stitched together with scraps of wonder and dream stuff. It was our own kingdom, a fortress perched on top of scenery of our choosing, with rope ladders dangling in winds only we could feel. No rules, no boundaries, just an infinite cosmic playground that we could call our own. It was a place that collectively existed inside our minds, a place we barely understood but hardly questioned. Kevin was soaring through the air on a giant hawk, lion, zebra thing he had made up himself. He had a sword in one hand and the neck of a dragon in the other. Jordy and I were holding down the fort. We had been trying to track down that son of a bitch for weeks. I heard my mom's heavy footsteps barreling toward my room. Somehow, she always knew. "Guys, I have to go. Mom is coming in hot." "Seriously?" Jordy wasn't happy. "Are you just gonna leave us hanging like this with the world at stake?" "Sorry, it's 2 a.m. You know how my mom gets." "Lucky you," said Kevin. "My mom only barges in when I'm sneaking a peek of Channel 46 at night." "At least your mom knows you like girls, unlike Tommy's mom. Isn't that right, Tommy?" The vicious vernacular of the barely prepubescent boy. The usual clubhouse talk. Kill or be killed. I wasn't up for the fight. Next time. "All right, that's enough for me, guys. I have a quiz in the morning, and it's already too late. Kevin, can you meet me in the clubhouse at 10 a.m.? "You got it," said Kevin. I landed back in my bed just in time for my mom to think she saw me sleeping. I only say landed because leaving the clubhouse, a place buried so deep in my mind, felt like falling from the ground onto the roof of an 80-story building.
The next morning, I walked into Mrs. Van Bergen's math class. She had already had the quiz, perfectly centered on each kid's desk. Ruthless. She was in her 60s, and whatever joy she had for grooming the nation's youth into the leaders of tomorrow had gone up in smoke like the heaters she burned before and between all classes. As I sat at my desk, I watched each kid trudge on in with their heads hung low, but mine was hoisted high. I had a Kevin. As soon as all the kids sat down, I shut my eyes and climbed into the clubhouse. Like the great friend he was, Kevin was already waiting. Question by question, he not only gave me the answer, but gave a thorough explanation on how to solve each problem. He was the smartest kid I knew. Math? No problem. History? Only a calendar knew dates better than him. Any test he helped me take was bound to find its way to the sanctity of Mom's fridge. We were getting to the last few problems when Jordy decided to make an unwelcome appearance. "Tommy? Kevin? Are you guys in there?" Jordy yelled as he climbed the ladder. "Guys, you have to check out this new song." "I don't have time for this right now. I'm in the middle of—" Jordy's round face peeked through the hatch. "So, I'm driving to school with my mom today, and this song came over the radio. Fine Young Cannibals, you ever heard of them?" "No, I haven't. Seriously, though, Kevin is helping me with my She Drives Me Crazy, ooh, 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 ooh." Jordy, Can you please just, like no one there else, ooh, ooh, ooh. Geordie. My patience, which was usually deep but quite shallow for Geordie, was used up. Geordie froze. I'll hear all about your song after school, I promise. We are getting through my math test. Academically, Geordie wasn't the brightest. Socially, too. To be honest, all of us were probably socially inept. Hell, we spent most of our free time inside our own heads and up in the clubhouse. Geordie had dangerous levels of wit and could turn anything into a joke. Although his comedic timing was perfect, the timing of his comedy was not. There were far too many times I'd be sitting in the back of class, zoning out and into the clubhouse, and Geordie would crack a joke that sent me into a violent fit of laughter. Needless to say, all the confused eyes in the physical world turned to me, and just like that, the saga of the strange kid continued. If I close my eyes tight, I can faintly hear the laughs from that summer reverberating through what's left of the clubhouse. It was the summer before 8th grade, and it began as the summer to remember. The smell of fresh-cut grass and gasoline danced through the air. The neighborhood kids rode their bikes from dusk until dawn, piling their aluminum steeds into the yards of kids whose parents weren't home. They ran through yards that weren't theirs, playing tag, getting dirty, and wearing holes in their jeans. Most importantly, they were creating bonds and forging memories that would last and continue to strengthen among those lucky enough to stick around for the remember whens and maybe grow old together. I participated in none of it.
While all the other kids were fighting off melanoma, I was in the shadows of my room, working on making my already pale skin translucent. Although my room was a sunlight repellent, no place shined brighter than the clubhouse. As the boys and I inched towards that last week of summer, we laughed, we cried, we built fantastic dreamscapes, rich with stories and lore. We were truly flexing our powers within the endless walls of the clubhouse, but soon, the vibrant colors that painted the dreamscape would darken into unnerving shades of nightmares. Unless one of the boys was on their yearly vacation, it was abnormal for the clubhouse not to contain all three of us. Our gift or burden had some sort of proximity effect. The further one of us traveled from one another, the weaker the signal would become. But something wasn't adding up. Each week that went by, Kevin's presence became scarcer. He wasn't out of range. I could feel him nearby, sometimes stronger than usual. Kevin began going silent for days at a time, but his presence grew in a way that felt like warm breath traveling down the back of my neck. I didn't understand. By the time the last week of summer arrived, our power trio had turned into a dynamic duo. Don't get me wrong, I loved Geordie, but I could only handle so many unsolicited facts about pop culture and his gross obsession with Belinda Carlisle, even though I was mildly obsessed myself. The absence of Kevin felt like going to a dance party with a missing leg. It was Sunday evening, the night before the last time I'd ever see my friends. Geordie and I were playing Battleship. B6, I said. A rocket shot through the air and across the still waters. The explosion caused a wake that crashed into my artillery. "Damn it! You sunk my battleship! Can you read my mind or something?" Geordie was flustered. "No, you idiot," I said. "You literally always put his ship on the B row every single time. You're too predictable." "I call bullshit. You're reading my mind. How come I can't read your mind?" "Maybe you need an IQ above 20 to read minds?" The bickering swept back and forth. Right before the bickering turned hostile, a welcome surprise showed itself. "Kevin!" Geordie, ecstatic, flew across the waters to give Kevin a hug. He held him tight. "Where have you been?" I asked. Kevin just stared at me. His bottom lip began quivering as his eyes welled up. He kept taking deep breaths and tried to speak, but the hurt buried in his throat fought off his words. We all waited. With great effort, Kevin said, "I don't think I'll be able to see you guys anymore." The tears became contagious. My gut felt like it was disintegrating, and my knees convinced me they were supporting an additional 500 pounds. The light in the clubhouse was dimmed. The whispers came with the wind that smelled like snow, voices so quiet I couldn't be sure I was actually hearing them. Sometimes they seemed to be calling a name, sometimes just murmuring, like people having a conversation in another room. I'd turn my head to catch the words, but they'd fade into nothing, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined them entirely. But Grandpa heard them too. I'd find him sitting in his chair at midnight, eyes wide open, responding to things the rest of the family couldn't detect. "I'm sorry," he'd whisper to the empty room. "I know you're cold. I know." When I asked him who he was talking to, he'd look at me with the desperate expression of a drowning man. "You can hear them too, can't you, Theo?" His voice barely above a whisper. "The voices in the wind." I nodded, and something between relief and terror crossed his face. "Then you know she's coming." The shivering started in June. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, teeth chattering, pulling my covers tight around me. The room would feel normal to everyone else, maybe even warm, but my body acted like I'd been sleeping outside. When I mentioned it to Mom, she immediately started checking for fever and asking about my appetite. "Growing boys need more calories," she said, adding extra bacon to my breakfast. "Your metabolism's probably just running high." She couldn't see the frost forming on my bedroom windows while the thermostat read 75 degrees. Grandpa started acting strange around the same time, but this was different from the whispers. This was paranoia. He began looking over his shoulder when we watched TV together, checking the locks on doors that nobody ever used. During dinner, he'd pause mid-sentence and listen to sounds the rest of us couldn't hear, his fork halfway to his mouth, eyes darting toward the kitchen doorway. "Nothing there," he'd mutter when I followed his gaze. "Just tired." But tired people don't spend 20 minutes staring at the same photograph, and they don't whisper apologies to themselves while they think no one's listening. I started finding him with those photo albums more often, usually the ones from his working years at the IGA. He'd flip through pages slowly, his finger tracing faces I didn't recognize, his lips moving in silent conversation. One afternoon in late June, I found him in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, still in his pajamas, staring at the spot where his body would be found 3 weeks later. The linoleum around his bare feet was covered in frost that sparkled under the overhead light. "Grandpa?" He turned toward me, but his eyes took a moment to focus, like he was seeing me from across a great distance. When he exhaled, his breath formed a small cloud between us. "She's coming," he said quietly. "She's been walking through the snow for 27 years, and now she's almost here." "Who's coming?" I shouldn't have stopped. I should have helped her. But she was so cruel, Theo. So very, very cruel. I asked him what he meant, who he was talking to, but he just shook his head and shuffled back to his room, leaving wet footprints on the kitchen floor that steamed in the warm air. I grabbed Jordy. "I know." The tears continued. "I'm glad you came." "Have you heard from Kevin?" asked Jordy. "I'm sure he's on his way." Jordy and I sat on the grass and waited. It was surreal. I was sitting with one of my best friends that I had seen every day, yet had never seen before in my life. He looked just like he did in the clubhouse. In that moment, whatever trouble I could have possibly gotten into for sneaking out was worth every second of the experience. From right behind us, a deep, gravelly voice emerged. "Hey, guys!" We both shuddered at the same time and seized up. We were busted. Nobody allowed in the park after dark, and we were caught red-handed. Once again, the adults came to ruin the fun. "I'm sorry," I said to the man. "We were just meeting up here. We're leaving now." "No, guys,"
the voice said cheerfully. "It's me, Kevin." I don't know how long my heart stopped before it started beating again, but any machine would have surely said I was legally dead. This wasn't the kid I played with in the clubhouse. This man towered over us. He was huge. What little light the night sky had to offer was blocked by his wide frame, casting a shadow over us. His stained shirt barely covered his protruding gut, and what little hair he had left on his head was fashioned into a bad comb-over, caked with grease. I can still smell his stench. "This is incredible! You guys are actually real! You both look exactly like you do in the clubhouse. I'm so excited!" Kevin took a step forward. "Want to play a game or something?" We took a step back. There were no words. Kevin took the back of his left hand and gently slid it across Jordy's cheek. Kevin's ring sparkled in the moonlight. "God," Kevin said, "you're just as cute in person as you are in the clubhouse." There were no words. Kevin opened his arms. "Bring it in, boys. Let me get a little hug." I didn't know what was wider, my mouth or my eyes. Each muscle in my body was vibrating, not knowing which direction to guide my bones. Away was the only answer. Jordy's frozen posture made statues look like an action movie. Kevin grabbed Jordy by the back of the neck. "Come on over here, you big goof. Give me a hug." Kevin looked at me. "You too, Tommy. Get over here. Seriously." Jordy was in Kevin's massive hairy arms. Fear radiated from his trembling body. There were no words. "Come on, Tommy, don't be rude. Get on in here. Is this how you treat your friends?" Jordy began struggling. There were no words. Kevin's eyes and mine met. I could hear his breathing. The moment felt like eternity. With Jordy dangling from his strong arms, Kevin lunged at me. Like a rag doll, Jordy's feet dragged across the grass. Kevin's sweaty hands grabbed my wrist. I can still feel his slime. There were no words, only screams.
I panicked. I didn't know what to do. In that moment, there was no thinking. The primal brain took over. I shook, I twisted, I turned, I shuddered, I kicked, I clawed. The moment my arm slid out of his wretched hand, I ran. The last thing I heard was Jordy scream. It was high-pitched. Desperation rushed my ears, its sound finding a permanent home in my spine. The wails continued until Kevin, with great force, slapped his thick hand over Jordy's mouth. I'd never hear Jordy's laughter again. I pedaled my bike like I had never pedaled before. The breeze caught from my speed created a chill in the hot summer air. I pedaled all the way home. God, did I pedal. When I got back home, I sprinted into my parents' room, turning every light on along the way. They both sprung up in bed like the roof was caving in. I begged them to call the police. I pleaded in every way I could. Kevin isn't who he said he was. I said it over and over. He took Jordy. Jordy is gone. I told them everything. I told them Kevin was moving, and the thing we shared didn't work at distance. I told them I had snuck out to meet them. None of it registered. I was hysteric. To them, the game was over. The jig was up. My parents weren't having it. They refused to call the police. When I tried picking up the phone myself, my dad smacked me across the face so hard he knocked my cries to the next street over. There were no words. "Enough is enough. It's time you grow up. I'm tired of this fantasy bullshit. We're taking you to a specialist tomorrow. I refuse to have a freak under my roof." They didn't believe me. The look in my mother's eye told me I was no longer her little baby boy, her strange and off-kilter boy. She covered her eyes as my dad gave me the ass-whooping of a lifetime. I had no more tears left to cry. The clubhouse. I miss it, mostly. I haven't truly been back in over 20 years. I don't even know if I remember how to do it.
It's probably better that way. After that terrible night, I spent the next couple of days going back to the clubhouse, trying to find Geordie. I prayed for a sign of life, something, anything to tell me where he might be so I could save him. The only thing I caught were glimpses of the most egregious acts. Acts no man could commit. Only monsters. I don't care to share the details. On the third day after Kevin took Geordie, my parents and I were on the couch watching TV when our show was interrupted by the local news. Geordie's face was plastered across the screen. His body was found in a shallow creek 20 miles outside of town. My parents' faces turned whiter than their eyes were wide. They looked at me. I couldn't tell if those were faces of disbelief or guilt. Maybe both. There were no words. Every once in a while, I muster up the courage and energy to walk alongside the clubhouse. I can't quite get in, but I can put my ear up to the door. I can still hear Kevin calling my name. Hey, this story really freaked me out. The creepy vibe of the open door and that gruesome discovery of Isabel's body gave me chills, especially the idea of someone mimicking her voice. The dog's reaction just adds to the paranoia. It's terrifying how close the danger feels.
And here's the final story, the most terrifying one.
My neighbor's front door has been wide open for 2 days. Since it was a sunny Friday afternoon, I didn't think much of it at first. It was 5:30, and I had just returned home from work. When I saw that my neighbor's front door was open, I assumed that she was simply unloading something from her car. I went inside my own house and went through my usual after-work routine, going for a run and then making dinner for my wife, Alice, and me. It was only in the evening that I began to suspect something was wrong. I was taking our dog, Bailey, out for her final walk of the day. It was nautical twilight, my favorite time to be outdoors. I've always enjoyed strolling around the block with Bailey in those last precious moments when there's still enough light to see the horizon. I put Bailey's harness on her as she excitedly hopped around. Then the two of us stepped out into the cool night. After a few seconds, I looked up and noticed that the door to my neighbor's house, the one directly across the street, was still wide open. Also strange was the fact that despite her car being in the driveway, the house was completely dark, not a single light on inside.
I crossed the street. My neighbor is a 20-something named Isabel. She seems like a sweet girl, but we aren't exactly good friends. Sometimes I give her lemons from our tree in exchange for figs, and that's pretty much the extent of our relationship. Still, the sight of that open door made me uneasy. What if she had some kind of medical emergency and was currently unconscious, or worse, on the floor of her entryway? After a few steps up the driveway, the leash in my hand went taut. Looking down, I saw that Bailey had seated herself firmly on the ground, refusing to budge even as I called her name and tugged on the leash. Her ears were pricked up, her eyes fixed on the house like she was waiting for something. Though she wasn't growling, I was unnerved by her alert posture and her refusal to walk any closer to the door. I let my voice close the distance between us and my neighbor's threshold. "Isabel, it's Brian from across the street. Can you hear me?" For a moment there was only silence. Then, just as I was about to drop Bailey's leash and walk up the steps to the house, there came a voice from the dark. "Hey, Brian," she said, before coughing once, and then clearing her throat. "Sorry, I'm in the middle of dinner here. What's up?" I breathed a sigh of relief. "Hey, sorry, I just saw that your front door was open. Wanted to make sure you knew."
Strangely, there came another long pause. I knew she was inside the house now, and close enough to the door to hold a conversation with me. So what was the delay? "Isabel? Oh, you're so sweet to check in. Yes, I know it's open. It's just been so hot today that I wanted to let the breeze in. I'll close it soon." "Of course. Have a good night then." "You too." With that, I tugged Bailey back down the driveway, and the two of us completed our walk. I returned home, happy that my neighbor was all right, and went to sleep. Saturday was a much-needed lazy day. I woke up at 10, ate the breakfast that Alice made, then spent some time in the backyard with her and Bailey. It was an overcast day, and by 3 p.m. or so, a light rainfall forced us back inside. Alice took a call from her sister, who lives at the edge of our neighborhood, while I went to the living room to throw on some television. Except, before I could get comfortable, I looked out the front window and was surprised to see that Isabel's front door was open again. Open again? I wondered. Or was it never shut?
I got up close to the window and studied the house across the street. The rain was coming down harder by then, and the thick, gray clouds overhead made it seem like nighttime. Despite this, there wasn't a single light on inside of Isabel's house. It was so dark inside that the entrance to her house seemed less like a door and more like a black painted rectangle on the exterior wall. I turned to look at Bailey, who was laying on a nearby couch, and saw that she was also looking out the window. Ears pressed against her head, she glanced at me briefly, then refocused her attention outside. I couldn't tell if she was simply people-watching or if somehow she, too, could sense something wrong. Just then, Alice walked into the living room. She was no longer on the phone, and she greeted me with a strange, almost nervous smile. "That was an odd conversation," she said, taking a seat next to Bailey. "Everything all right?" "I don't know. Clara saw a woman peeking into her house a few nights ago." "What? Creepy, right? And she's not the only one. Apparently there have been a few reports on her side of town, other people experiencing the same thing. Nothing stolen and no one hurt, at least that Clara knows of, but it's still pretty weird. Let's make sure we lock up extra well tonight." My thoughts drifted to my neighbor. I asked my wife what this woman looked like. Like I said, Isabel and I weren't close, but I knew she had recently gone through a difficult breakup with a long-term boyfriend. It was far-fetched to assume a connection between Isabel and the mystery woman, but who knew? Heartbreak makes people do crazy things. Maybe there was some link between the two.
Alice hesitated for a minute. "Well," she eventually said, "you know Clara. She's got a real superstitious way about her. She's always telling stories." "What does that mean?" "It means you've got to take this with a grain of salt." When Alice relayed Clara's description of the woman, I felt a chill run down my spine. Clara said that the woman was tall and gaunt, enough so that she originally mistook her for a man. She said that her skin looked too tight across her face and that her eyes looked unnaturally deep-set, as though they were too far back in her skull. Apparently, when she saw that Clara had spotted her, she had given Clara a big smile before retreating into the night. Apparently, when she smiled, she had too many teeth. I was silent for a moment, unsure what to make of Clara's morbid sighting. "Love, was Isabel's front door open this morning?" She considered my question as she pet Bailey. "I think it was." If nothing else, I figured I should at least tell Isabel to be careful. I put on my raincoat and headed outside, carefully making my way down the wet driveway. Once I made it to the sidewalk, I heard frantic barking coming from behind me. Turning around, I saw Bailey in the window, her paws resting on the sill, her growls and whimpers rising over the heavy rain. My wife appeared next to her a few seconds later. She attempted, unsuccessfully, to comfort Bailey, giving me a questioning look as she did so. I gave her a shrug in return, then crossed the street. I stopped at the bottom of Isabel's porch steps and listened. Like before, I could hear someone inside, though I couldn't tell exactly what was going on. I heard a deep, wet ripping sound like something being torn. Also, like before, I couldn't see a thing inside the house. A voice called out from the dark interior. "Brian?" "Hello again," I said, only wondering, in retrospect, how she could have known it was me. "Sorry to bother you again, but I wanted to tell you something. Would you mind coming out for a minute?" "Brian," she repeated, tone almost reprimanding. "This isn't a good time. You always seem to catch me in the middle of a meal." "It won't take long," I tried persuading. When she didn't respond, I climbed up a few steps. Isabel, there's been some suspicious activity around the neighborhood recently. I know you like to keep the door open for the breeze, but maybe you ought to keep it shut today. Oh, but I'm so comfortable here on the couch. Why don't you close the door for me? The couch? Wasn't she in the middle of a meal? Even if she were eating on the couch, her voice sounded so close, like she couldn't have been more than a few feet away from me. Was she hiding behind the door? I climbed up the rest of the steps, trying to recall the inside of her house from the 2 or 3 times I'd been inside. I knew that the room immediately to the left of the entryway was the living room, and most likely where Isabel was supposedly sitting. I also knew that there was a light switch right next to the front door. What the hell? I thought. I'll just go inside for a minute, say hello, and then shut the door for her. It'll give me some peace of mind to actually see her instead of just hearing her voice. I glanced over my shoulder toward my own house. Bailey was still barking her head off, which was unnerving, but the sight of Alice keeping an eye on me gave me some peace of mind. It was just a house, I told myself, just a normal house with my own neighbor inside of it.
Taking a deep breath, I stood at the threshold, shocked at how, despite my closeness, the inside of the house remained pitch black. I thrust a hand inside, and it disappeared like I dipped it into oil. As I groped around for the light switch, my fingers brushed against something solid, something fleshy. I jerked my hand back, certain that I'd just touched a person. "Isabel?" I asked the darkness, and then, from inches away, came the sound of laughter. The laugh was deep, gravelly, and mocking, and it did not resemble my neighbor's voice in the slightest. Before I could react, I heard the quick pitter-patter of footsteps against wood. It grew quieter and quieter, and I realized that it was the sound of someone running away from me. After a few seconds, I thought I heard a door open and shut in the distance. The back door, perhaps? Again, I stuck my arm inside, and this time I was able to find the light switch. I turned on the light and was relieved when the interior of the house revealed itself to me. A normal entryway with a normal coat rack and a normal shoe rack. No eerie intruders in sight. However, the relief was short-lived because when I stepped inside the house, I turned to the left, walked into the living room, and was greeted by the sight of my neighbor, or at least what was left of her. She was splayed out atop a couch, her head lolled off the side. Her empty eye sockets and toothless, wide-open mouth looked like 3 holes had been dug into her face. Her face itself was red, not, as I initially thought, because it was covered in blood, but because it was missing its skin. She had been flayed, not only her face, but her arms and the top part of her torso. It looked like someone had been methodically working their way down her body until I had interrupted them. Paralyzed by fear and confusion, I stood in place. I waited to wake up from a nightmare. I waited for Isabel to walk in from an adjoining room and tell me that I was looking at a Halloween prop. I waited for a dangerously long time, and then I staggered out into the rain. When I returned home, I immediately called the police, though I had trouble putting what I'd seen into words. They arrived quickly, took my and Alice's statements, and then went across the street to investigate. It's been days now. They haven't told me anything, despite my repeated calls to the station. I can't get answers, can't sleep, can't eat. I just keep replaying the discovery over and over in my mind's eye. The voice, the feeling of brushing against a body in the dark, and of course, the sight of that poor girl's mangled corpse. I have too many questions to count, but 3 rise above the rest. Who the hell was I talking to? How did they sound so perfectly like my neighbor? And why is it that every night since I found the body, Bailey hasn't stopped sitting by the front door and growling? And here's the final story, the most terrifying one. This story really freaked me out. The creepy vibe of the open door and that gruesome discovery of Isabel's body gave me chills, especially the idea of someone mimicking her voice. The dog's reaction just adds to the paranoia. It's terrifying how close the danger feels.
This is the scariest and my favorite story. How about you? Which one did you like best? I'd be thrilled if you'd support the video with a subscription and a like. Have a great day, everyone.